Hi and welcome to RJ Academy. And today we will study Class 10 History, Chapter Nationalism in India. I am so pumped to take you through this explainer because, honestly, we aren't just looking at dry dates and facts here. We're diving into literally one of the most dramatic stories in human history. We're going to explore this massive, profound, emotional shift of an incredibly diverse population moving from colonial subjugation to somehow forging a single unified national identity. It's an absolutely wild journey.
Let's take a quick look at the agenda. We'll be hitting 6 key phases: the spark of awakening, the non-cooperation movement, different visions of Swaraj, the Salt March, diverse voices and limits, and finally, forging an Indian identity. All right, let's jump right in.
Section 1, The Spark of Awakening, covering 1914 to 1919.
So, think back to 1914. India wasn't actually directly involved in the First World War. But because India was a colony, this global conflict triggered an absolute domino effect. Britain's wartime defense costs were just skyrocketing. So what did they do? They hiked up custom duties and slapped on an income tax in India. Between 1913 and 1918, the prices of everyday items literally doubled. It completely crushed rural India. And to make matters even worse, villagers were forced into army recruitment to fight a war that wasn't even theirs. Oh, and right at the exact same time, widespread crop failures causing acute food shortages. It was just a perfect storm of hardship.
And if famine and war weren't enough, an influenza epidemic swept through the country. According to the 1921 census, a staggering 13 million lives were lost to famines and the epidemic. Think about that number for a second. 13 million. The country was plunged into this deep anger and despair. People were desperate for a leader to basically voice their suffering against all this colonial oppression.
And then, enter Mahatma Gandhi. He returns from South Africa in 1915, bringing with him this totally revolutionary new idea called satyagraha. Now, the best way to think of satyagraha is like winning a massive, intense debate. But you don't win by throwing punches or shouting. You win by letting the undeniable power of truth completely disarm your opponent. It was all about peaceful, nonviolent mass agitation. And you know what? It worked. He successfully tested it in Champaran, Quetta, and Ahmedabad, proving that, truth actually could challenge the British Empire.
But as you'd expect, the empire struck back. They passed the oppressive Rowlatt Act in 1919, which literally allowed them to jail Indians without a trial. Naturally, protests erupted across the country, which leads us to a really dark day. April 13, 1919. Innocent civilians who were completely unaware that martial law had even been imposed gathered for a peaceful Baisakhi fair at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar. General Dyer blocked the exits and ordered his troops to open fire on the crowd, killing hundreds. This horrific massacre was the absolute turning point. It completely shattered any remaining faith in British justice and instantly turned peaceful protests into a massive, urgent demand for a nationwide movement.
Moving right along to Section 2, the non-cooperation movement.
So to actually shake the empire, Gandhi realized that isolated protests just weren't going to cut it anymore. He needed a unified front of Hindus and Muslims. So by aligning with the Caliphate movement, he launched the non-cooperation movement in 1921. The core idea was so simple: just stop cooperating and the British rule collapses. Thousands of students started boycotting British schools. But put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine being a student in the 1920s, bravely walking out of your colonial school out of pure national pride, only to face an agonizing reality. Where do you actually go? There were almost zero Indian educational alternatives at the time.
Honestly, despite those huge daily challenges, the urban boycott worked brilliantly at first. People were literally burning foreign clothes in massive bonfires, which actually cut the import of foreign textiles right in half. Indian textile mills and handlooms saw this massive boom. But the movement in the cities did eventually start to slow down, and the reason is pretty practical. The beautiful Indian khadi cloth was entirely hand-spun, making it way more expensive than the cheap factory-made British cloth. And without those alternative Indian institutions we just talked about, students and lawyers basically had no choice but to eventually return to the British schools and courts.
Section 3, different visions of Swaraj.
Now, this call for Swaraj, or self-rule, was echoing all across the country. But here's the fascinating part. Different social groups interpreted it in wildly different ways, mostly based on the struggles they were dealing with every day. While urban lawyers and students were peacefully boycotting institutions, rural peasants in Awadh saw Swaraj as freedom from their own oppressive local landlords. These peasants were being crushed by punishing taxes and this forced unpaid labor known as begar. So for them, Swaraj actually meant violently attacking landlord estates, looting bazaars, and organizing basic service boycotts.
Meanwhile, down in the Gudam Hills of Andhra Pradesh, tribal communities were absolutely furious over strict forest laws that completely banned them from their traditional livelihoods. They were led by Alluri Sitarama Raju, who became a huge folk hero, and they fought using violent guerrilla warfare because they honestly believed nonviolence just wouldn't work for them. On the flip side, over in Assam, plantation workers interpreted Swaraj simply as the right to freely return to their home villages. They actively defied the Inland Emigration Act and tried to flee the tea gardens. Everyone wanted freedom, but their definitions of what freedom actually meant were drastically different.
Section 4. The Salt March. Okay, so after the violent Chauri Chaura incident halted the movement in 1922, the Great Depression hits in 1929 and absolutely devastates rural India, totally collapsing agricultural prices. Gandhi knew he needed a really brilliant symbol to unify this newly impoverished, heavily fractured population, and he found it in the most ordinary thing imaginable: salt. I mean, why salt, right? Well, it was consumed equally by the rich and the poor, it was heavily taxed by the British, and the government held a super strict monopoly over its production. It was just the perfect everyday representation of an oppressive colonial law that literally affected every single Indian home. So in 1930, he launches the Dandi March, and the logistics here really highlight his absolute genius for symbolic action. He and 78 trusted volunteers marched 240 miles over 24 days. Thousands and thousands gathered just to watch them along the way. And when they finally reached the coastal town of Dandi, Gandhi simply boiled seawater to make salt. By doing that, he officially broke British law. That single, simple act electrified the entire nation.
Section 5. Diverse Voices and Limits.
Breaking the salt law totally shifted the goal. It wasn't just about not cooperating anymore. It was about actively breaking colonial laws. But participation was complex, because different groups had their own distinct motivations. Rich peasants joined hoping to lower those crippling revenue demands caused by the Depression. The business class heavily funded the movement mostly to stop cheap foreign imports that were ruining indigenous production. And incredibly significantly, thousands of women stepped right out of their homes to participate in protest marches, seeing their involvement in the independence struggle as a deeply sacred national duty. However, it's really important to note that this struggle had some severe limits. The Dalit community felt deeply ignored by the Congress, prompting leaders like B.R. Ambedkar to demand separate political representation, which eventually led to the Pune Pact of 1932. Similarly, the Muslim community felt increasingly alienated amid rising religious tensions and the failure to secure joint electorates. On top of that, industrial workers were mostly sidelined because the Congress, frankly, didn't want to upset the wealthy industrialists who were funding the whole thing. So that dream of total, seamless unity, it remained pretty elusive.
Section 6. Forging an Indian Identity.
With all these competing political agendas, you might be wondering, what actually kept this massive population together? Well, what ultimately united them was a profound cultural awakening. The nation started being personified in the divine calm image of Bharat Mata. Leaders traveled from village to village, just reviving ancient regional folklore and songs, basically proving that India's culture was incredibly rich long before the British ever showed up. And waving those newly designed tricolor flags, especially the ones featuring Gandhi's spinning wheel, it forged this really deep emotional bond among millions. History was being completely reinterpreted, not as a story of backwardness, but of ancient greatness.
Let's do a quick review of the massive strides we've covered. We started with the Rowlatt Satyagraha in 1919, which was an immediate reaction to oppressive laws and that terrible tragedy at Jallianwala Bagh. That grew into the broader non-cooperation movement in 1921, which worked to unite Hindus and Muslims. And finally, that evolved into the direct lawbreaking of the civil disobedience movement in 1930, sparked by the iconic Salt March.
And to bring it all together, let's map out a chronological chart of all the major incidents from this chapter. From Gandhi's return in 1915, going through the tragedies, the massive boycotts, the tactical pauses, all the way to those vital political agreements like the Gandhi-Irwin Pact and the Pune Pact in the early 30s. Take a quick second to piece this entire dramatic timeline together in your mind. It's truly a lot of history in a very short time.
Looking back at this entire evolution, it leaves us with a pretty incredible question to ponder. How does a deeply divided, colonized region successfully forge itself into a unified, self-aware nation? Well, that is the true, enduring legacy of nationalism in India. The notes of this chapter is in the description. Catch you next time.